Hi there, it's Marla here at Narrate. In this week's message, Adam continues to discuss the desires and expectations that we bring into our relationships. How do we make our relationships more functional as we consider the desires of others? What does God's Word have to say about mutual submission in marriage? Enjoy the second message in the Relationship Charades series.
So if you weren't with us last week, we started this conversation called Relationship Charades, and we're going to jump back into that. There are those mornings where I'm just astounded at the quality of people and who we get to do this with. And so for those of you who are owners around here, it sure is great to be a part of this with you and an honor. Do you realize we had 2 students on stage this week with the band? Like, that's pretty amazing. A middle school and a high school student, and let's just be honest, like, it's not like they were the weakest link either. So it's awesome to be a part of this with you and watch all that unfold. And I sure hope we get to do this for a while together. The series we started last week was this series called Relationship Charades, and I'm pretty shamelessly stealing a series that Andy Stanley did years and years and years ago, and then again most recently to create this frame. But really what we're doing is saying that there's this game, and it's not just marriage. If you're not married and you're like, great, another one of those stereotypical kind of church services where they talk about married people and I'm not married. I totally get that. I think this is easily applied to business. It's applied to the classroom. It's applied to your friendships. But nonetheless, what we've noted is that there's a way of communicating within relationship that becomes a bit of a charade. And it's really simply that we don't actually say what we mean. We say something else, and then we leave the other person to guess what we're saying, because the way we feel loved is when the other person doesn't respond to what we say, but to what we hint at. And what we're trying to do is drill down on that dynamic and create some alternatives that maybe create for a more functional kind of relationship. And those of you elbowing your spouse, that's not very kind. There's a lot of this going on right now, which is really awesome and affirming. So last week, what we talked about was this incredible tension between desires and expectations. That the reality is God made us for desires, that it doesn't take much creativity or much reading of the text to see that God didn't create robots. He created people with the expectation that they would create themselves. Augustine, who almost 2,000 years ago now said, love God and do what you please, which in our kind of fundamentalist culture, if we're not careful, becomes pretty scandalous. But what he was saying is that the love of God, once it captures you, lends itself to all kinds of creative expression. And that's not a permissive statement. It instead speaks to the character of God and the way this thing happens when we connect with him kind of statement. But what we talked about last week is that while desires are great things, they get us in some trouble. And they get us in trouble because they make us vulnerable to the fact that we can't control outcomes. We talked about the Olympics and the pursuit of gold medals and championships and all kinds of other accomplishments in business and other leadership roles. And the reality is, no matter how much you desire something and how hard you work for it, the brutal part of desire is you don't have total control over the way your cells multiply and what your health looks like in the future. You don't have total control over whether or not that business is successful. One of the things that grates at me, because we talk so much around here about the daily leads to the dream and this idea of outwork the person next to you, it drives me bonkers when I hear, like, after the Super Bowl or after some kind of big match in sports where the person being interviewed who won the game says, I'm so glad we won because we worked so hard. Because frankly, I find the implication offensive, don't you? Like the implication is I won because I worked harder. And I get that happens, and probably, if we broke it down, there are people on one team who worked harder than other people on the other team. But if we're being honest, when you're talking about the difference between the gold and the bronze medal at the Olympics, we're talking about way more than outworking somebody else. We're talking about factors and variables that are outside of our control that contributed to their demise and your victory. And the point is simply this, then, that what James says is about desires has some kind of lasting truth to it. James says this in verse 1. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from the desires that battle within you? And he hits a nerve there. That desires are things that we're made to, there's something we're made for, that we're supposed to do, and yet the tension is they make us vulnerable to all kinds of disappointment. And so the question that we asked last week is, okay, so when do desires get us in trouble? And James helps us here too, because in verse 2, I guess I do have to read. This is one of those that I've read a bunch that I sometimes don't even have to look at. He says, you desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. See, he notes that one of the dangerous parts about desires is when they become expectations, we do all kinds of things that we otherwise wouldn't do. It's one thing to desire this for your marriage or your business or your pursuit of a sport, but when you expect it, well, that's when we do all kinds of things that we would otherwise normally not do. And part of what we talked about last week is what makes it even more dangerous is that line between desires and expectations is very subtle, if not invisible. And oftentimes what happens is we don't realize we've crossed over this line until we have some kind of emotional outburst that cues us to, like, wait a minute, something else is going on here, because it's really not that unreasonable that the light was red. Right? Like this, it's this desire expectation thing that we do. In fact, last week we used this bucket, which is kind of my way of grieving that at the baseball fields right now there's 2 feet of snow in the batting cages. But we use this bucket to illustrate that when we walk into a marriage, when we walk down the aisle, we're holding a bucket full of desires about our money, about our job, about our cars, about what we're going to drive and where we're going to live and whose house we're going to celebrate Christmas at. And that's okay, but the danger becomes is what often can happen in a marriage is we walk down the aisle because what we're doing is expecting this other person that we're entering into covenant relationship with to fulfill our desires, which means this goes from an opportunity to a weight. And part of what we explored last week is that, therefore, one of the things we would do well to do is just stay emotionally aware of what we are desiring. That to talk about this. And it's not a one-time thing. You don't get to do premarital and then never have to do it again, because the reality is it's a moving target. Our desires are constantly changing. So the other thing we explored last week is, okay, what if we do well to make sure that we're, to whatever degree we can, like, talking about and not allowing our desires to stay subconscious, and especially not playing this kind of charade where we know what they are, but we want you to guess them because that's the way we feel affirmed. So the homework last week was for you to go like, okay, so what are some of my desires? Easy enough, right? Here's what I want to do this week is, okay, so once we've identified what our desires are, or if not all of them, once we've gained some semblance of an understanding of our desires, then what do we do? How do we function then? And to be honest with you, in my head, and I don't claim to be able to exhaust the answer to the question, I think there's at least 2 answers, which is my way of teasing you to go like, come back next week, because I think there's a whole part 2 to this answer, what do we do with our desires? But I think the first place requires us to kind of go back to the roots of it all. And for many of you, nothing I'm going to say this morning is new, but sometimes the beauty of being a part of a community like this is being reminded of things that we already knew, but in our pursuit of new, we forget what we already had. And to do so would take us all the way back to the Passover, this famous meal that Jesus had. Part of the reason I wanted to give you this image was just to double down on the cliche that Jesus was a white European. Mostly what I wanted to do was kind of create a picture that would say this was a far different looking meal than some of our popular paintings. Like this would be much more what an ancient Near Eastern Passover kind of setting would look like. Now, we think of it as the Lord's Supper, but what they were celebrating was the most important meal in the calendar that the Jews had. And on this particular meal, which turns out would be just hours before Jesus was arrested, all kinds of crazy things were happening, not the least of which was Jesus said to his guys at one point, hey, I've got a new commandment for you. Now we kind of go like, well, of course, Jesus was God, he gives commandments. That could have sparked a rebellion right then and there. That for Jesus to say, I have a new commandment, the guys probably should have got up and left at that point. Because the Jews had 613 commandments. They knew that. Most of them came from Moses. They knew that. God gives commandments. People, they can order them, they can prioritize them, they can interpret them, they can apply them. People don't give commandments. So Jesus was doing something very subtle, even by the suggestion that he could give a new commandment. But there's all kinds of stuff going on. Judas had left to run an errand. There were things happening. And so everybody just kind of stayed together. And eventually, and John tells this story, in chapter 13, Jesus looks at them, and it would sure seem like it's the guys. It kind of bugs me because we know Jesus had female followers, but we don't necessarily know were they present at this meal. I need to do some work there. Maybe some of you know that answer. But nonetheless, at least to the 12, Jesus in John 13 says, okay, a new commandment I give you, love one another. To which one of the cynical ones, which are probably 12, would have went, that's not new. To which Jesus would have said, and I'm not through. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And what Jesus does here, here's the danger. You're so familiar with this that we miss it. Part of what I want to do this morning is go like, how do we take this statement and apply it to every decision we make, especially within marriage? Because what Jesus could have done in this instance was looked across the table and went, hey, James and John, Remember how just a few days ago, not that long ago at least, you kind of pulled me off to the side and you explained how we were the first and second smartest disciples and most committed disciples. And so when we get to Jerusalem and I build my castle and I set up my government, that you felt pretty entitled to be the vice president and the secretary of state. Remember that, James and John? Yeah. And do you remember how everybody else, when they found out how you had done that, they kind of thought you should be kicked out of the group, like that was a little devious and unkind? Yeah. And you remember what I did ultimately? Well, they said, you explained that in your movement, the most important are servants. And yeah, do you remember what else I did? And they said, yeah, you just said, okay, let's keep going. And what he could have done, maybe he did do, is went, James and John, here's the deal. My new commandment is this. For the rest of your life, here's what I want you to do. I want you to run the filter of how do you treat people through the filter of how did I treat you at your worst moment. And he could have looked at Matthew and went, hey, Matthew, remember where we met? Remember what you were doing? And Matthew went, yeah, I was a tax collector. And Jesus could have said, remember how you were a complete embarrassment to your entire nation and God and people and family? Yeah. And remember what I said to you, Matthew? And Matthew might go, well, you just said, come follow me. Jesus is like, exactly. Do you remember where we went from there? And maybe Peter would have piped in and went, yeah, we went to his house. I remember it because it was the worst day of my life. We spent the entire evening partying with his vagrant friends. And Jesus might have said, okay, so Matthew, Peter, for the rest of your life, as you try to understand relationships at work and at home and with your kids and with your neighbors, here's what I want you to do. I want you to run it through the grid of how I treated you in that particular situation. And hey, Nathaniel, do you remember what you had said just before we met? Nathaniel would have been like, yeah, I kind of do. Something like, how could he possibly be a good person? He's from Nazareth. And do you remember what I did? He said, you just looked at me and said, come follow me. And you remember how I haven't brought it up since? And Nathaniel said, well, you just did. But remember, other than that, I haven't brought it up since? Yeah, so for the rest of your life, Nathaniel. He could have went around the room, and maybe he did. Maybe in a different occasion, he looked at Mary and said, hey, Mom, remember how you questioned my very authority and you were kind of pushy and constantly driving your agenda? Remember all that? Remember how I still allowed you to stay close? And he could have looked at some of the other women. Remember how when we met, you were a prostitute and the way I treated you in the midst of that as you were coming out of that? See, what Jesus establishes here, and this is the most undramatic thing, especially if you're familiar with the claims of Christ, but at the same time, it's the most difficult thing. What he establishes here is that for the rest of Christian history, his desire is we determine how do we treat the person standing next to us by the way he treated us or by the way God treats us through him. Andy Stanley, to whom I'm indebted for the frame of this series, he calls it the platinum rule. That the golden rule says do to others what you would want done to you. The platinum rule says no, it's even more tricky than that. The bar's even higher than that. Do to others what God through Christ did for you. Now, where's the relevance of that? Well, it's this. The question becomes, we have 4 Gospels, and then we have 23 additional books. And if you've ever spent any time reading any of the New Testament, you know that there's times where you're like, what in the world are we talking about? This guy is a barbarian. This guy is a chauvinist. It gets really, really confusing. Here's one really helpful thing that I learned years ago that was just a game changer for me in my ability to read the scriptures and not get thrown off too much. And it's simply this, that the New Testament is not trying to do systematic theology. It's not trying to do theology the way we often do it in the West today, where we take these abstract ideas about God and say, here's who God is, and here's what he does. What the New Testament is doing is practical, applied theology, where you have real people really trying to understand what it means to follow Jesus in this city, in this time, in this place, in this situation. Which means we've got to be careful when we're interpreting it to go, okay, what's the context by which we're doing this? Which means this, here's for me the simplifier. Every time we read anything from the New Testament, the opportunity we have is to see that what they are doing is applying the platinum rule. Based upon what Jesus said his new command was. Why is Paul saying this? Why did Peter say this? You picture it like the old guy with the mono lens, which more and more I am that guy in my kids' life, and it's a painful realization. I said epic this morning, and they looked at me like I was from Mars, and I was like, oh, that one's off the list too? Like, man, I am the furthest thing from cool, and I'm not even 40. What we get to do is, as you read the New Testament, go, okay, the lens that I have to read all of this through is how do we treat people in light of the way God through Christ treats us. Well, Paul does that. There's a long way around the barn to say what Paul does in Ephesians, which is one place that Paul does this, is he does this very thing as it relates to what were called the household codes. In Ephesians 5:22, this has become one of my very favorite verses, and some of you, we've spent time here because this is culturally such an important verse that we can speak to intelligently. But listen to what Paul says in Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. I mean, what could be more clear than that? Let's pray. Now, if you're all like ticked off and ready to leave and you're like, I can't believe I came here this morning because I knew this is what it was going to be like, I'm so glad you're here and I'm so glad you're bothered. And we'll talk about why I think that's a good thing in just a second. But if you're someone that you've left your childhood faith, you've left church, you don't come with her, you don't come with him, you're deeply bothered, you're not sure you could read the Bible for yourself because of statements like this, I'm very, very glad you're here because we get to deal with this because this verse bugs us. Now, remember, what we have in the New Testament are not a series of emails, they're a series of letters. And where we might copy and forward text messages, they copied it and forward letters. The oldest letters we have of Paul's writing to Ephesus, if you were to translate those Greek words into English, would read like this. Go ahead to that next slide. Wives to your husbands as to the Lord. To which those of you who are English nerds and love to peruse my emails with all kinds of faults, which you should, would go, where's the verb? There's no verb. Part of what I want to answer this morning is where's the verb? But before we do so, I think we've got to point something out. See, when Paul wrote this for the first time, and they read the letter and it said, wives to your husbands as to the Lord, or wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord, nobody was bothered. Like all the men would have been like, yeah. All the women would have been like, yep. They would have all, this was the most normal thing ever, and partially because of this law called patria potestas. What patria potestas says, which was an ancient Greco-Roman law, and what it did was it gave legal jurisdiction to the male head of household over their animals, their children, their slaves, and their women. So when Paul said this for the first time, all the women would have went like, well, duh, because if we don't, he'll sell us. If we don't, we'll have to commit ourselves to a life of prostitution. If we don't, like, there's very little hope for us whatsoever. It was the most normal thing ever. But here's the ironic thing. You are, I would guess, surrounded by people who are deeply disillusioned with Jesus and local church because of this verse. So there's some irony here. First people who heard it went like, duh. We hear it and we go like, that bugs me. And it should bug you. But here's the awesome thing about this. Why does it bug you? I think this is one of the really important historical questions we can ask about the influence of Christ because we publicize with great detail all the mistakes of the church. Why does this statement bug you? Well, it's because, and I understand there's danger with myself being a male saying this, and I'm not claiming we've arrived, but it's because on some level we have agreed and are working towards the equality of gender. We've said that we're both valuable and made by God. And why do we feel that way? See, here's where it gets ironic. Take Jesus being God or not God off the table. Why do we feel this way? Well, we feel this way because authoritative voices like Jesus pushed against the trends. And in fact, take the divinity of Jesus off the table, it wouldn't take much effort to argue that you can't identify a male authority figure who did more for the rights of females in his day than Jesus. So do you see the irony here? We get all ticked off, and we should, because it's a very archaic concept. We get ticked off and we want to leave church, but the ironic thing is, wait a minute, Jesus is the reason we're ticked off. We even feel permission to be ticked off because he was arguing for the value of women. You with me there? Okay, so what's going on here then? Well, we have to go the verse prior. Verse 21 says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So remember, Paul's writing a household code. This is like those things that you put the stickers on your wall, and it's like live, laugh, love. This is the household code on the wall. And the top one is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And the principle here, the writing style here, is that authors would borrow the verb from the primary thesis statement throughout the rest of the deal. So the idea is submit is implied in every relationship that Paul is now going to speak of. the relationship between men and women, the relationship between parents and children, the relationship between slave owners and slaves. It's implied, which is why when Paul said this, no one got all fired up. No one got all mad. Because he's teaching this idea that is in fact radical, but the radical part wasn't that women submit. The radical part was what he was working towards. He starts with the kind of normal, boring, we got to get this thing off the ground before people walk out, and at least we can get them trapped in the middle of the aisle, and they at least have to hear it out because it'll be awkward if they leave. He starts with the boring and works towards the controversy, and here's the controversy that Paul got himself into. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. This is when they would have reacted. This is when they would have went, wait a minute, you're telling me I have an obligation to my woman? This was a culture, remember, that the role of women was to provide kids for the male. And women, bear in mind that men went off to war, so women could do it all. There's all kinds of cliches that don't hold true in the ancient Near East. I was just listening to someone talk about that recently. But nonetheless, within the relationship between husband and wife, the woman's obligation was to provide children. The husband's obligation was to provide food and shelter. And beyond that, there was very little relationship. There was no call for sexual fidelity, for example. And Paul comes along and he goes, hold on a second here. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. And some of them went like, wait a minute, is this the same Christ who died on the cross? That didn't end well for him. And Paul said, exactly. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. See, we leave when it says, wives, submit to your husbands. They would have wanted to leave when Paul said, hey, husbands, your wives and their desires are just as important as your own. And he keeps going, verse 28, in the same way, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. Remember, this is the culture that invented naked gymnasiums. There was high value on bodies, and Paul is going, hold on. Your wife, the one at home who you don't even talk to, you just like the kids she's given you, she's as important as your body. He who loves his wife loves himself. There's this mystery. Paul is here speaking of this idea called mutual submission. And some of you go, wait a minute. So what you're telling me is what Paul is saying is the first thing I'm supposed to do with my desires is put his desires, her desires before my own. Yep. And some of you know firsthand how vulnerable that makes you. That's why we've talked about this desire thing makes you vulnerable. Some of you are on the receiving end currently or in the past of how brutal that gets. How if one person's doing it and not the other, it doesn't go well. Some of you, it's why you're divorced, because it requires two mutual parties doing the same thing, which is why, in my opinion, the church in its efforts to kind of guide us towards marriage, it's not prude, it's not controlling, it's not legalistic, it's honest. For this marriage thing to work, you're going to have to be in relationship with a person who systematically learns to put themselves after you and vice versa. And if that thing is going to work, it's going to require two, which means you ought to be careful with who that person is. That's the historic church's efforts to guide the way we marry. I have this really strong memory of my friend David Casey and I used to go for long runs every Monday, and there was this one Monday on John G. Mine Road. Isn't that, you kind of always place yourself where you were, and we were talking about marriage, and he stopped, and he looked, and I always got annoyed. I'm like, we can't stop. Like, that's the one rule of running. You never stop. But he stopped, and that drives me crazy. And he looked, and he said, I knew when I married Deidre that she was an amazing woman. He said, but I had no idea how amazing. And then he said, I actually think this is where he stopped. And I had no idea how important that would be. Why? Because mutual submission, man. And some of you are first, some of you know this. You're astounded. You kind of feel like you got lucky. You kind of feel like, wow. And some of you are deeply hurt by this. But the reality is what Paul is saying is you want to do this marriage thing the way Jesus talks about life in general, it's learn to put their desires before your own. The way this was framed for me, and this has always been really helpful for me, and I'm probably repeating myself, but this category has historically been so helpful for me. In my early 20s, when I was new to Jesus, there was a guy named Fred who was really influential in my life. And the way he talked about this for me, both before we were married and after we were married, was he talked about it as your dream. He said, this is the way he taught me, you can do with this what you will, that husbands loving their wives as Christ loves the church, he thinks that the most honest way to apply that would be to say, as a person, once you get married, Your number one dream is that relationship. And no other dream gets to come before it. Doesn't mean you can't have them. He just would say, and he was very forthright, Adam, I want you to understand, if you choose to walk down that aisle, you are choosing for the rest of your life that nothing gets to be more important or have more priority than that relationship. And somehow that category for me, I'm not claiming to have lived it out perfectly, but it's always been helpful for me. So was the fact that in my early 20s, I watched a scenario play out. There was a family who was very involved with the start of Harvest, and they were a phenomenal family. In hindsight, they were in their younger 30s, and they were former athlete people, and they were beautiful, and they were kind of hung out with Fred a lot, so I knew him that way, and he was really, really successful. In fact, he had developed a really good skill at refereeing, and I want to be careful here, but he'd become really, really good at refereeing high school basketball games to the point where he became a Big Sky Conference men's a basketball referee. He was traveling all over the Big Sky Conference refereeing basketball games. And I loved this guy. You showed up on Sunday mornings, and Alex and I would have been able to do this together with him on many occasions, but he just set up folding chairs, like 10,000 of them, and he and I could talk Broncos forever. He was a Bronco fan and this great guy, and I really liked him and still do like him, really respected him. And then one Sunday you showed up, and it was just, he wasn't there. And it was pretty ominous, and you kind of got the feeling like, don't ask. And to be honest with you, eventually what we all learned, and it was handled in a very, very healthy way, in my opinion, what we all learned was that he had made a series of decisions that made him not trustworthy within his marriage anymore. And I only tell that story, hopefully not to objectify him or to claim that any of us aren't capable of doing the same thing. But for me, as a young 20-something who wasn't raised in evangelicalism and just loved the idealism of evangelicalism, it was earth-shattering for me. Because it was the first time I'd watched a spiritual giant prove less than perfect. And thankfully, I had the opportunity to process a little bit with Fred. And I'll never forget that one of the things he said is, he said, Adam, remember that whole dream thing? I said, yeah. And maybe this is judgmental. I sure hope not. But he said, let's just say that there had been considerable conversations about some of his pursuits and the whole priority of this dream thing. And I really think that's a major piece of what happened there. And for me, that idea, and I'm not claiming to get this perfectly, but what Paul is saying here is, listen. You want to know what you do with your desires? At the very least, you make sure that her dreams come before your own. And you trust that within the context of that vulnerability, it will work out. In fact, the scenario Fred would always use with us was, and I don't even hunt, but he'd say, Adam, here's the way I understand this, is you say, if you want to go hunting, you say to your wife, this is literally his example, not trying to pick on any of you avid hunters. You say, this is the way I understand this, Adam, you say to your wife, do you mind if I go hunting? Her obligation, he said, is to answer forthrightly and honestly and not couch anything or hide anything or in any way kind of determine what she says based upon what she thinks you want to hear or what she's afraid to say. Her obligation is to say honestly what she thinks. And his opinion was, and loving your wife as Christ loves the church, is you follow her desire. You do what she says in that scenario. And the mystery of it is that when two people are dancing in rhythm on that very issue, somehow this thing works. And you guys, as much as we are offended by what Paul was saying, they were too, but for a completely different reason. Because culturally, it would seem we swing from one side or the other as to what gender gets the preference and how do we work this thing out. And Paul, in his own day, was controversial for different reasons in saying, dudes, her desires too, and first. So how do we apply this? How do we do this? Well, here's my 2 cents. I gave you homework last week. Here's my 2 cents worth of homework this week. And if you're here with your spouse, then you've got this awkward thing of like you both heard it. So you kind of have to do it. I think, guys, you got to look at your wife, and you got to go, so what are your desires? And there's one other thing you have to do as soon as you ask that question. You know what that is? Shut your mouth. Because she might pass out. I mean, she might just faint. She might get angry and start yelling at you like, I can't believe in 20 years. She might start questioning how genuine you are. And she might have reason to do so. But you've got to start having that conversation. And if we're to reverse that, ladies, and to be honest with you, on most of these gender kind of stereotype things, my wife and I reverse in most of them, just being honest, in case I hadn't already done enough to make you question my masculinity. On most gender issues, we reverse. On this one, we don't. Because here's what's going to happen, ladies, is you're going to go, so what are your desires? What do you desire? And he is going to go, nothing. Isn't there a game on or something? And here's the problem. He's not lying. I know that because for 3 months I've been trying to figure out, like, if Teresa asked me that question, what would I say? I've still got like half of an answer. It's not that he doesn't desire anything. It's not that he's lying. It's that we have this much trouble putting words to those things because somehow, and I think for those of us who've been in Christianity for a while, ironically, it becomes all the trickier to actually even give voice to what we desire. It's awkward. It's uncomfortable. It's confusing. We don't even know. But be sure of this. He has them. And if he's not willing to say them, he's just expecting you to fulfill them. Like, here's my ideal. I don't know what they are, but if you could figure them out and act on them for me, then that would be the perfect marriage scenario. I think we got to do this. And somehow we got to come to the grips with the fact that God desires a similar relationship with us. Because the question becomes, so what do I do then with my desires? I mean, if I'm supposed to tell them to him, tell them to her, okay, that's part of it. But that also means that I've also got to loosen my grip. What do I do with the ones that I have a hard time loosening my grip on? And that, we got to talk more about that next week, so don't miss next week. Jesus, thanks, Lord, that you didn't give us a set of theological principles, but you gave us a flesh and blood example in yourself. Jesus, thanks that life isn't something you expect us to just nail first try, but that really, if you are who you say you are, the higher win is finding grace. And so God, I pray in our relationships, in our offices, in our marriages, we would know grace. And we would also know that God-honoring desire to grow and improve and get better, knowing full well that we'll never be perfect and we'll constantly have to turn back to grace. And Jesus, I pray for the office places represented and the homes and the neighborhoods that as a community of owners kind of trying to follow you together, that one of maybe the most important scattering we would do in our community would be that of finding a way of doing marriage that's actually fulfilling and functional. And that in that we would have new ways of narrating your story to our own friends in our community. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.